Okay, I want to talk about why the act man is often perceived to be a kind of bad faith actor. And it's because he frames things in such a way that there's one side in these discussions that frames things as woke in a kind of arbitrary way and wants to cancel stuff just like the left tends to do, and that's not the actual issue here. So I'm kind of forced to define terms for someone like him to not just outright be dismissive of them. So I'm going to define what people are referring to as woke in a very detailed way. So to it's necessary to explain the conflict and the issue here. So please bear with me. So, the easiest way to describe woke is what people refer to as cultural Marxism. Now, the distinction between cultural Marxism and economic kind of Marxism is that cultural Marxism focuses on a social aspect, and more traditional, sort of economic focused Marxism is more focused on economics, obviously. So the way Marxism criticizes the free market is saying that there's a managerial upper class that's wealthy and exploits the harder working, poorer lower class who does most of the manual labor, and it's a completely one-sided relationship, and it's necessary for something like the government to interfere and then create equity where everyone ends up having the same kind of house, the same kind of car, the same access to health care, the same access to education. So everyone ends up the same economically. And that's their idealized interpretation of how to fix whatever the issue is, the inequality. Now, you take that lens and you apply it to social issues. So you do something like what is most infamous is the idea of the patriarchy, where you take men and you say they are the oppressor of everyone. So, like, men unconditionally oppress everyone else. So that mostly means just women, but you could say women and children or whatever. And it's unconditional, so because it's all men contribute to how society is in some level, so even a homeless guy is somehow oppressing and exploiting even wealthy women. It's taking that Marxist economic lens and doing that with different things like that. That's the gender war stuff. You can do it with race and designate a race or two or whatever and say they oppress and harm all other races. You can do that with religion. Say a specific religion is oppressive and restrictive to all other religions. And you can do that with, like, able-bodied people and disabled people, and kind of have this messed up view that able-bodied people are the oppressors and exploiters of disabled people. And so that's how you get these kind of social dynamics that cultural Marxism creates. It's this combination of a bunch of different social issues like that, framed through that kind of Marxist lens. And they think the way to fix all of that is equity, so that everyone ends up at the same result. And that has potentially horrific implications when you're thinking about disabled people and regular able-bodied people, because either you can talk about prosthetics to try to lift people up, or like advanced medical technology to try to lift people up closer to able-bodied people, but the dark implications of that is to do things to able-bodied people to lower them down to equal ground to people who are not able-bodied. And I'd rather not try to detail that. So, there's issues with saying equity is unconditionally good, right? Because it can have bad implications. So my main point is that's the kind of ideological lens a lot of these people are trying to put into games. Now, there aren't any ideas that should be disallowed from art, in my opinion, right? So you should be able to talk about all kinds of things, but there's a distinction between art and propaganda. So art can present all kinds of ideas. It can show conflict. It can show contrast of political views or ideological views. Like you could have a free market capitalist and a communist in a movie and have them interact and show contrasting views, and then you allow the audience to interpret who was the better person or whose perspective they like better, or if someone was more right about certain things and not other things, right? You allow the audience to interpret those characters' actions that might represent certain ideological views. It's that audience interpretation part that is necessary for stuff to not be propaganda. So propaganda, you'll have often very narrow views, like a singular ideological perspective, and then you tell the audience the correct way to interpret it. So then it's telling the audience they have to take a specific message away from something, or like they can't think about it. They're not allowed to think about it. They have to take it one specific way. Now, this tends to be a problem with subjective subject matter. So like philosophy and certain stuff about economics and religion and all kinds of stuff is more in the kind of debatable subjective side of stuff. When you get into the technical objective stuff, like the idea of a mechanic's manual for a car, that there isn't room for interpretation as much because it's dealing with very specific logical things, and there's only one correct way to interpret it, right? So that's still like that non-fictional objective stuff isn't propaganda either, because it deals with something where there isn't a perspective you can have on it per se, right? So it's propaganda tends to exist in these subjective problems that humans all struggle with. So it's those two things of propaganda combined with cultural Marxism that we're seeing kind of forced into certain media, because cultural Marxism tends to be the prevailing ideological perspective. So he mentions BioShock, and he says, well, why is it BioShock can criticize capitalism and not be woke? And I'm going to talk about that. But
are on here, I was a teenage exocolonist? Contains overtly anti-capitalism messaging? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? So does BioShock. Criticizing capitalism is woke now.
So the difference between like BioShock and a lot of other stuff is BioShock explicitly is a critique of libertarianism, and it's the idea of a completely unregulated free market and they're like, that's a very specific kind of dynamic, and it's meant to show a kind of extreme. And on top of that, the game isn't like just about that. That's more like kind of the background details, is that critique of libertarianism. The story is about this main character who's effectively a pre-programmed assassin, that it was pre-programmed by one guy to kill another guy, and you're that pawn in the game, and so you have to struggle through with, at first, being kind of an unfree man. You're just kind of a tool of someone until you get more autonomy over yourself. And it's sort of about that story and that adventure and some of the whole what makes a man kind of thing, right? So it has multiple elements to it. So the point is, BioShock is actually about stuff, and it has a bunch of different ideas, and you can interpret it a bunch of different ways. And although it's critiquing libertarianism, it's showing an extreme version of libertarianism. And you can say, well, okay, maybe libertarian's a good idea, but it was taken too far, right? So you can even have that kind of interpretation, where it's not entirely destroying the idea of libertarianism while being still critical of it. And it's not saying you have to interpret it that way, right? You don't have to say libertarianism is bad. You could say the people involved were all bad actors, and that's ultimately what caused all these problems. But it's not the system that's the problem, right? So you can have all kinds of ways of viewing it, and that's what helps make it not propaganda, is it's not trying to force you to take an explicit message from it. It leaves enough room to kind of take what you want out of it, and there isn't a correct answer or anything, right? So that distinction is very, very, very important if you want something to not be propaganda. So the biggest issue I have with this video is he's critiquing this list. Like, this is a straw man kind of a list where no one believes this list is legitimate. It's the woke content detector curated list of games. I've never heard any person say this is a legitimate, earnest list or defend it. Everyone's bashing it. So it's a straw man to kind of say this is at all representative of people who have issues with woke stuff being in games. If you want to argue against people like that, you need to go after a more steel-manned perspective. So, to give an example, we have Cabrutus's website. Now, I can believe Cabrutus is being sincere, right? And I know people might argue about that because some people see him as kind of a grifter. But I'm going to assume he's sincere. And can we make critiques about his list? Well, I can only comment about stuff I may have actually played. Or I might have some familiar with some familiarization with the controversy, right? So I do know a little bit about one or two games on this list, and I'll talk about them a little bit. So if you go down here, he has Stellar Blade on his list. He says it's censored, and he talks about kind of the controversy and the Grums doing the change.org petition and all kinds of stuff like that, and the whole free Stellar Blade thing. And what we found out about it is the outfits that were changed in it last minute are not like, there's patents on them. in Korea at least. And so we don't know why they changed the outfits. If they changed the outfits because they couldn't get the proper licensing to use the original outfits, at least when the game released, then we know that could be an explanation. If the game was censored because of a Sony mandate, or maybe in-house they decided to censor it for some reason, or maybe they were worried about a higher age rating or something, then we don't know why, right? Was it censored, or was it like a copyright issue? So it may not be correct to claim Stellar Blade is censored because it's too much of a gray area to say whatever actually happened with it, right? So that might be an inaccurate aspect to this list. So it could be like boy crying wolf kind of a thing, right? So if we go up here, I can't say too much, but I guess old school RuneScape is the other game I have a lot of experience with. To the extent, okay, since like 2007, right? Since the 2007 version, whenever they relaunched that, I believe they added stuff like a Pride event thing, which people took issue with that because you're kind of doing a real world political holiday thing. It's kind of weird and stands out. It's like if they had a 4th of July celebration thing, it would be weird if it was like explicitly 4th of July and stuff like that, especially because the game's based on a fantasy England-like inspired land. So you would think more of the stuff that's culturally relevant to the UK would be in there. So maybe even UK specific holidays and stuff like that would be more appropriate, right? And when you look at how World of Warcraft handled holidays, I know that's a different MMO, but they did like their own interpretation of Christmas, their own interpretation of Thanksgiving, their own fictionalized versions of those holidays. They didn't do explicitly Christmas or something because it would be really confusing and it would take you out of the game and it wouldn't feel lore appropriate, right? So that's why people have issues with some of the stuff done in RuneScape, is it's in contrast to the England inspired fantasy setting, right? And it takes you out of the game. So if they were more nuanced about all of that stuff and they were careful about how they put stuff in the game and it added variety instead of homogenizing the whole experience, then people would probably receive it a lot better, right? So that's why people have an issue with old school RuneScape. So it's not like it's just nothing, right? Something's there. So see, if Ackman wants to he wants to say, okay, most of the people who are talking about woke stuff in games, they're not doing a good job about it. He should be talking about someone like Cabrutus, right? But he won't do that because it would be highly unpopular to criticize Cabrutus. And I can't find anything overtly obviously a problem with the way Cabrutus does his list. Now, there are things that people are a little critical of him, like he kind of got popular incidentally, like he was just, part of it was like right place, right time, right? Anyone could have done the same thing that he did. Not to belittle the guy, not to disrespect the guy. So they see it as they kind of see him as kind of a grifter because they see him as like monetizing his fame as fast as he could possibly get away with, right? So that's often why people feel kind of critical of him. Now, I don't know him at all personally, and I've never talked to Brutus. I don't know what motivates him, right? I can't really comment on that stuff. But that's where people are kind of concerned about him. Is he really doing a service for the public to try to help people? Or is he just kind of exploiting the little fame that he got? That's up for debate. But you should be, like, Actman should be going after people like him, right? Who most strongly represent that side and show issues with how they conduct themselves and the kind of arguments they make. And it shouldn't be that hard to do if you're right. Because either the way you should handle stuff is either you can argue against a certain perspective and show the issues with it and show why you believe the way that you do, in spite of the fact that it's a otherwise very solid alternative point of view. Or you can admit maybe you're wrong about something and you don't properly understand something, and maybe adjust your perspective with the new information that you've gained and whatever you've learned, right? That's how you grow as a person. But the way he's doing stuff is he's kind of bashing just this straw man of a list that nobody agrees with, that nobody's going to defend because it's popular to bash it and it's something easy to do, rather than have a legitimate discussion about people's concerns about cultural Marxism and how it may be a detrimental impact to media by simply being propaganda and not being art. Right? That's what the issue is. Why can't you talk about the issue, man? That's why people are this upset about it. They want art. They don't want propaganda.